Okay, we'll start the next section. Um, I'm also want to introduce a few simulators that people nowadays are using. So the first one is Mjoko, which is very popular from different communities. I think I made a mistake on the videos, but essentially they are physics engine that you can simulate multi-body and multi-objects interactions. So most of people in robotics using the rigid body interactions because that's relatively fast. But Mjoko indeed can simulate deformable objects and then objects with different materials or elasticities. Um, that's a pretty like accurate simulators. So in recently, they also have updated versions which utilize GPU to accelerate all the forward dynamics and contact detections. So this is from their official blogs. So if you simulate the original humanoid Mjoko using Python, which is the default for many RL research, it's pretty slow. And if you have a lot of engineering effort, you can increase that by a lot. But by using the GPUs, you can make it significantly faster and provide a lot of huge number of samples for your RL algorithms. That's Mjoko. And so next step is something that is, so I would say less popular than Mjoko, but is still very important in the development of sim to real, which is ReSim and Brex. So ReSim is essentially a parallel it's a parallel simulator that written purely in C++, which provides Python interface, and that's the foundation of a lot of ETH's locomotion work that I'll also show in the 10 slides after that. So Brex is another library that built in JAX, and so the purpose of this library is to study exactly study where you have parallel simulated environments. So is that improve the performance of your policy gradient methods, or like how far, like how much it can improve? And there are also ISAC which is a very critical for nowadays robot learnings, which let me trying to play. So ISAC is produced by NVIDIA, and of course, naturally supported by NVIDIA GPUs. And what they can do is to simulate 10,000 or more than 10,000 of environments and to doing different tasks. And so I have been personally switched. So I have been experiencing the path from Joko to ISAC. So I think there are in the paper, they claim that the speed is the most important part. I think speed is definitely a huge advantage of ISAC. But for me, the most good part is that I found if I want to make the Mjoko or PyBleed another kind of CPU library to be fast, I need to utilize the CPU as much as possible. And this brings a problem actually. So in our workstations or clusters, because these clusters is not specifically for RL, it's specifically for neural network training. So usually there are maybe 10 GPUs, but the CPU is not that good, because if you consider training neural network, the CPU is not heavily used compared to GPUs. So if I'm going to create some environment libraries that can make Mjoko very fast, I can only run one experiment in a 8 GPU machine. But that's a huge limitation. But in ISAC, because all the things is naturally implemented in GPU, so the CPU utilization is actually low, and you can run the same amounts of experiments as your GPU numbers. So in the context of deep learning, in the context of using workstation built for deep learning, that's also a huge advantage. And of course, there are problems of using isoGym, mainly coming from you are using CPU, you are using GPU to solve all these use these contact detections or contact collisions. And one thing that maybe not considered before, at least for me, is that in deep learning, we always using the float point arithmetics. But so that's already enough, like empirically showing that you can training good neural networks using 32 floating point. But for physics simulations, so sometimes to resolve this contact, you also need higher precisions, which might be a reason that you will find some unrealistic behaviors in isoGym that will not appear in some CPU counterpart. Okay. And next, we are also going to talk about RL plus SimTrial and what changes has been made to make it work right now. So the key of SimTrial success is the idea of you have parallel simulations. You have the concept called domain randomizations. So firstly, remember previously we were talking about RL training is not stable, and maybe it's because at each time step, the sample trajectories is not enough to cover a wide range of distributions. But this thing has changed if you have a parallel environment that can generate data points at a significantly faster speed. So in the isoGym examples, it can generate maybe 10K, actually 100K of transitions per second. So you suddenly have 100K of or equally amount of batch size that can help you to optimize your policies. And this number is, of course, depending on how complex these environments, but it's definitely better than you just have 200 batch size that will make your policy training not very stable. And there are also a challenge of SimTrial gap. And the SimTrial gap is caused by a lot of different factors. So for example, in the physics simulators, we make a lot of assumptions to make it run faster, or maybe sometimes to make it even feasible to run. So for example, the objects is always being convexified, and we do not have continuous time in simulations. We only have discretized time. And the body is always rigid. I mean, there are simulators support deformable objects, but usually that's very slow. And there are also something called column frictions, which is not the true frictions we will have in the real world, but some approximate thing that you need to deal with when you compare when you consider the contact between two surfaces instead of 2 points. So that's from the physics side. So which means no matter how good is your simulators, how much you invest into your simulators, it's really hard to make it as realistic as the physics in the real world. On the other hand, there is also an perspective of photorealistic sensors is also very hard to simulate. So we have very advanced techniques in graphics or animations. And of course, we can simulate very realistic scenes. So this is from a movie called Jungle Book. But if you look at the cost of generating these kind of scenes is obviously not suitable for training robotics agents. And it turns out, of course, we can simplify this process, but the results is what we actually use in simulation. Some environment looks like this. So it's not bad, but it's definitely not realistic. So if you are training some models here, it's not going to be transferable to real world policies. And so this comes to the idea of domain randomizations, both in terms of visions and physics. So the idea of domain randomization is essentially, so domains which is like the distribution either in your simulations or in the real world, and you are going to randomize that distributions from different aspects. So the idea is in the training time, we are going to randomize a lot of things we can do. And more specifically, in this case, for example, the background colors and the color of the desktop, all the camera angles or camera specifications like extrinsic, intrinsic matrix. And for that, to training some either policy or your vision detectors. And the idea is really if the model sees enough simulated variations, the real world may just look like another simulators. And we are always not seeking to finding something that is as similar as the test time, but we are hopefully that some part of the simulators at one of the environment is similar enough to the test scene that is in the real world. And this is for the visual part. And there are also from the dynamics part, so this is a simple, I guess, should be a simple pushing task that training from simulation to the real world. So in the simulation training, for each of the rollout, the authors actually sample a different set of physical parameters, which shows here, the resolution is kind of a little bit slow, but essentially the robot's mass, the mass of the robot link, and also different controller parameters such as joint dampings, or the mass of the objects, friction of the objects. So all of them are kind of randomized in simulation training. And when you deploy in the real world, so you can imagine the environment has already been seen as a combination of all these randomized parameters. So taking it maybe visually is that if you consider you have a not randomized simulation data, it covers a little bit of distributions, but the real world distributions is much larger than that. So sometimes even your uncalibrated models have no overlap compared to the real world data. And the idea of domain randomization is to saying, I'm going to increasing the coverage of this data, not by looking at not trying to exactly replicate the real world data, but simply expand the boundaries of that simulated data to achieve a larger set of domain randomizations. And if a policy achieves good performance on these larger green regions, it will tend to achieve also good policies. It will also be a good policies in the real world distributions. Okay, any questions? And finally, in this section, we are also going to talk about a few success examples of sim-to-real and domain randomizations and see how they are going to evidence how the previous sections knowledge or techniques apply to these examples. So this first example is from OpenAI's first dexterous hand work. Before they are doing ChatGPT, they are also doing robotics. So the task here is you have a robot hand and you are manipulating this cube so that it becomes the same orientations as specified by this code. And this task is significantly is challenging if you're not doing that using RL. And the reason is because there are too many contacts and different types of contacts between your robot manipulators and the cube. So if you are doing a traditional control MPC-based methods, the search space is quite huge. And so basically you have each joint have a binary number. So if you only consider binary contact, each joint can have a binary contact of the objects. And all the possible, so you have maybe 26 joints, then you have 2 to the power of 26. And this is a very hard search problems, and previous control-based methods cannot do that. And
this extremely complicated recovery task was successful.
And this is another work from ETH, where they are doing sim tutorial for learning these robot recovery behaviors. So you have these robots that falling down on the ground from different configurations, and then it's trying to stand up. This is maybe from 2018 or 2019. That also, by the same logic, the challenge here is that there are too many contacts that not only using only the tip of the foot to make these recoveries. So you also need to use other part of your body to make this recovery. So if you consider that from a planning with contact perspectives, this is very hard to write or to solve these optimizations. And another examples, which is from our former lab mates, they are trying to do drone racings that can beat human champions. So in this case, it's not the challenge here is not exactly because of the contact. Instead, it's actually because when you have a very small drones and operate in a very high speed, pushing the limits of joint torques, affected by this air resistance force. So the physics model here is very hard to write. So this is not the same as when you consider most of the physics, you can ignore the resistance of air. But in this case, you need to consider that. And it's very physically challenging to write the equations. But in sim tutorial, you can do something to achieve this.
Is this replaying the motion?
Sorry, can you say it again?
Is this AI replaying the motion like recorded by another person, or is it?
Oh. Yes, so let me pause this. So this is real time. And there are 2 drones. Sorry, the videos is, let me trying to stop here. So there are 2 drones. I think this drone is controlled by a reinforced learning controllers. And this one is controlled by a human champion. And they are doing this racing in a very large stadium that the target is to you cross these doors in a sequential order. And whoever doing that fastest is win.
And is the input to the drone like, is it video, RGB video, or is it like?
It's RGBD camera input. Yes, but there are some. So the policy, so if I remember correctly, the policy does not directly take RGB, but they estimate some positions of where is the door. But the human racer will wear a VR device that also receives the first-person view of the drone. So the human is not from third person; it's also from like the viewing angle of the drone. Oh yes. So there is a slower replay that each of the drones need to pass different doors. And this is the human's viewpoint. And this is just from other captures. No. So this one, the obstacle is always fixed. But yes. So the R algorithm is training on the exactly same obstacles. But the human is also like have a lot of time to get familiar with this setup. And for sim tutorial, there are also a lot of success in locomotion and dexterous manipulations. So the majority of the content will be discussed in the later lectures on case studies on these 2 separate topics. And essentially, how to bridge the sim to real gap is in all of these like successful videos I have shown is kind of maybe three very important concepts. The first one is you need to have a proper system identification, which is sort of a requirement. So the system identification is essentially saying your robot system, where you command it to do the same thing in simulation and real world. So if you give the same action command for your robot in simulation and in the real world, you want the response of the robot to be the same. So otherwise, it's very hard to transfer if this is not even close. And the domain randomization, we have just illustrate a little bit. And also, we also need to find the correct abstraction, mainly from the vision perspectives. So I will give some of the examples in this. So for example, this is the examples of how the OpenAI train their reorientation policies, trying to manipulate the cube to be a specific pose. So firstly, they need to have a large amount of parallel environments because they need to collect huge amount of data, like billions in the scale of billions number of samples, to make their policies training stable. And in this case, what they use is actually exactly almost the same as we talk about is the PPO algorithms. And on the other hand, it also needs a lot of parallel environments because it needs to do a lot of randomizations. So if you consider your large batch of data, you also need to want the policy to be robust. So you simultaneously want your policy robust to all kinds of different physical environment, but you also want your policy, when you optimize the policy, you also want the data to cover a lot of distributions. So this tool it requires you to get a significantly larger amount of batch sizes. And the physical randomization they have is also very aggressive. So as you can see, the test set is actually the same cube across all the different runs. So one hypothesis, like when you initially trying to develop some systems, you might want to just trying to simulate the exactly same cube from the real world, like to make them the same as in the real world and the simulation. But this actually not quite works well because there are a lot of different reasons. So for example, the limitation of simulations, it exactly tells you, even if you define the physical parameters such as mass frictions to be the same, the dynamics of the objects might not be the same as in the real world because of a lot of simplification we mentioned in the previous slides. And also, there are also limited number of physical parameters you can define in simulation. So although there are like the most important, like mass, friction, center of mass, you can define that in the simulator. But there are also some other things, maybe the elasticities is not quite perfect, reflected in the simulations. And there are a lot of unmodeled effects when you consider the sim-to-real transfer. So even though they end up using the same robot cube, but they still need to do a large amount of domain randomizations on the objects. So for example, the object's dimensions, the size of the objects need to be changed. The mass of the objects and also the robot link also need to be changed. Also, frictions and controller parameters, also actuator parameters, also even the gravities also need to be changed. So all this, the purpose of all this is to cover a wide range of distributions so that in your real world, you hopefully in the real world transitions dynamics is falling on some set of these randomized dynamics. yeah, this is some, yeah. Cool. And apart from these physical domain randomizations, there are also a lot of small things you need to randomize. So for example, when you deploy your algorithms in the real world, the sensings you received from the robot is really not perfect. So if a robot tells you the joint now is 90 degree, it doesn't necessarily being 90 degree. And when you control the robot to be, I'm saying it's going to, this robot joint rotate to 100 degree. It's also tells, so sometimes it tells you it's 100 degree, but there are also some small errors that always happens in the hardware. And then in this case, a natural idea to extend the domain randomization, which is you can add a lot of observation noise, like the joint positions or object positions on that. And also there are also action delays when you send some command to your robot, it's not immediately sent. There are also some random delay that maybe 10 milliseconds. So depending on the robot, 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds. It's also not a fixed number of milliseconds to get that. And so that's another thing. And also there are also some very tedious but important step, like randomize what is the time step of your simulations. So simulations, essentially, you divide each simulation times. So you integrate all the velocities at a certain time intervals, and you also need to randomize that. So whether it's 100 milliseconds or 10 milliseconds. And there are also some like robot specific, maybe backlash or some random force onto the objects. So there are a lot of huge amount of things you need to randomize to make it work. So that's all from the physical and observational thing. And there are another aspect which we briefly talk about, the simulation images is really different from the real world images. And if we directly training a policy take RGB images, that's unlikely to work. So what we rely on for all this sim-to-real work is to finding something we call abstractions. So you are going to find some abstraction that although the RGB images is not the same between sim and real, and we hope the abstractions can be the same from sim to real. And in the case of OpenAI's dexterous hand, what they have is the object pose. So they have essentially training an object. So firstly, they have 3 cameras from different viewing angles, and from the simulation data, they randomize a lot of different colors or textures of either the robot or the environment together with the lighting scenarios. And they have these 3 cameras, 3 RGB images, and output object pose of the objects. And in this case, it's only a single cube. So this pose estimation is actually not very easy, especially when you consider all the occlusions you have for these in-hand manipulation scenarios. And this probably is the, so if you only consider one single object, this may be the best way you can get for pose estimation. And finally, like in the final deployment of their robot policy, they firstly have a state estimator from images, and the images will be merged to become some object pose. And so this is important because when you consider the policy trainings in simulations, so it only receives the object's pose and the object's pose fingertip positions together with other states that is physically meaningful. So it gets rid of all the rendering, not realistic rendering effect, and only consider some quantities that is very close from sim to real. And that's why it can work. Otherwise, if you go into train a vision policy, that will be significantly amount of other work to transfer it from sim to real. So this is one example, but these examples might be very limited because, so firstly, defining the object's pose is very limited. And if you have another object, it will be also limited. So this pose estimator is not going to work for more complex objects. So another example is from the, oh, yeah.
Does it represent multi-unit and
So they have 3 cameras viewing the cube from 3 different angles. And they are having, I think it should be 3 separate networks. I kind of forget. And then this is merging these 3 informations into one to have predict what is the object pose.
Remember how they merged it? Yeah.
I think it's just concatenations. Yeah. Yeah. And there is also a question, if you think about what if we don't have the concept of object pose? So for example, on another task, which is this drone racing task, you can see the drone is flying in the wild with no concept of objects. So you cannot represent leaves and trees as objects. But they can still do that by using sim-to-real and finding some correct abstractions between simulators and the real world. And in this case, their abstraction is the depth images. More specifically, if you consider this is the simulators they used for training their policies. So, and this is in the real world deployment, what the camera has seen in the robot drone. So this tool is very hard between this simulation and the real world. It would be very hard to transfer from sim to real, even if you have a lot of randomizations. So what the authors actually do is to have a simulated depth that trying to mimic what happens in the real world. So if you look at the depth of this is some modified depth from the simulator, but it also comes from the simulators. So if you look at the depth images and the real world images, so although they are not exactly the same, but the physical meaningness of each pixel is actually pretty much the same, because you can relatively accurately simulate how the camera formation or how the image formation works in simulation and in the real world, guided by your computer vision class. There is some 3D projections onto the image plane. And this is how they bridge the sim to real gap, not using the RGB images, but using the depths coming from, like using the depths from simulations and trying to match that to be the same as real world. And this work also have another aspect to be like completeness to describe these works. So you do not need to combine RL together with sim-to-real. So sim-to-real can also be together used by another set of things. So for example, in simulation, the advantage of simulation, if you remember, is we have all the states informations of the environments. So it would be easy to write a planning algorithm or even a sampling algorithms that sample some desired trajectories for the drone to finish. So in this case, for example, in their case, is you want to have a drone from point A to point B, but the most important thing is you want to avoid all the collisions. And in this case, you have all the information about trees in simulations. You can generate trajectories by simply sample along these different trajectories. And this is your like kind of expert policy that is a very good policy in simulations. And what we need to do here is trying to find some way to get supervision from this expert policy using only the depth images. So the upper part, the policy receives a lot of, so all the tree informations, all the ground truth state informations, but it turns out we can use only the measurement from, only simple measurements such as IMU, internal state of the drones, or the camera, or single RGB cameras attached on the drone to mimic the performance of the expert policies. And this is how they achieved this in the wild drone racings shown in the previous video. And this work is from the very beginning. I shown this. You are going to, so there is a drone racing winning the world champions. And the way they do that is still trying to do sim-to-real. So in this time is trying to consider RL algorithms. So it's kind of not too many things. So so in the previous work, you can replace this by reinforcement learning algorithms, because now your task is slightly more complex than following trajectories and avoid collisions. You also need to follow a specific order to pass through these doors. And in this fixed environment, RL performs very good. And the main difference in this work is actually what the authors observed when you want to push the limits to an extreme. So instead of only using sim-to-real, so sim-to-real, basically you get some models and then leave that alone in the real world. No matter what happens, you does not change the weight. But in this case, one important part is they also collect some data in the real world. So after you get this policy give some reasonable performance in the real world, you can have some you can get some feedback from the real world deployment to improve your simulations. So for example, one simple way to do that is you deploy your algorithms and then you record the trajectories in the real world. And then you check the difference between the real world and in the simulations. And there must be a difference between because there is a sim-to-real gap. But what you could do is you could learn these models from sim-to-real, that in the next round of training, when you're training in simulators, you're actually applying the physics in the simulator and add the residual physics you learned from real world to that. And in this case, your model is essentially learning on a dynamics that is closer to the real world dynamics, although that's still not going to be perfectly aligned, but this will improve the performance by a large margin. So that's essentially, and in this case, of course, the abstraction becomes even simpler because they can, there is some onboard detection methods, very lightweight neural network running to detect where is the gate. So also the gates have some markers here. So that's relatively simple compared to the in the wild forest perceptions. But still, that also gives you a flavor of they still need abstractions for their policy to do sim-to-real instead of taking directly the RGBD images to accomplish these tasks. Okay, and this is my last slide. And any questions? Okay, I guess very luckily we can end up earlier this time. Yes, I guess there are many questions about midterm, and I also don't know. Maybe next week, when Jitendra come back, you can ask him.